Hello guys, welcome to episode 3 of creating an API using the serverless framework and OpenAPI hub. In this episode we're going to look at how to design and specify the endpoints of your API, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a specification known as the OpenAPI specification. It is also known as the Swagger specification. They recently changed names. And so as you can see from last episode, we looked at some of the endpoints that were generated by the serverless. Obviously these are not the actual endpoints that we're going to use for our API, but I thought it was nice to go through them and see kind of what they look like and what they do. Now at this point I think it might be valuable to create a new file, and we'll briefly just call this one design.txt. And all that we're going to do really in this one is we're going to think about what are the endpoints that we want to include. Now, when we're designing for this particular tutorial, we are going to want to simulate a very simple kind of CRUD database. That means we need to be able to get some data. We're also going to need to be able to post some data. And we're going to want to be able to update that data or patch it, and we're also going to want to be able to delete our data. Now obviously at this point we don't quite know what the data is yet, but for the purposes of being as general as possible, let's think about getting data as getting a particular cell in a table. So you can think about Excel and you can think about the rows and the columns. So we would want to be able to get the cell corresponding to a row and a column number as input. And for posting data, we want to basically do the same thing, but we want to now specify row and column as well as the data. In this one we are going to make that a string. For updating data, this is very similar, so we provide a row and a column as well as the data string, and this will update that piece of information in the table. For deleting, we provide a row and a column, and it what it should do is remove any strings from this cell. So now that we have specified what we want our API to do, it's time for us to formalize this in a way that's a bit more productive. So we're going to move over and talk a bit about the OpenAPI specification. As you can see, the OpenAPI specification, blah 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 blah, was donated to the Linux Foundation. The important thing is that it creates a RESTful interface for easily developing and consuming an API by mapping all the resources and operations associated with it. Essentially, it documents all the endpoints and the schemas that are associated with your API so that you can more easily provide it to consumers, or in our case we're going to upload this specification to OpenAPI hub, and it will allow us to get more users and to potentially monetize our API in the future. Now, in my opinion, the best way to create a specification, I will say right now there are generators out there for certain frameworks that will allow you to generate Swagger files somewhat automatically, but for learning the specification and for getting some familiarity with it, I highly recommend for us to manually create a few Swagger files so that we can get familiar with the concepts and have a better understanding of exactly what we want to create before we go in and we create the actual business logic and the actual code for our design. So first, you'll notice that I've provided kind of a very simple template right here, and this will allow us to fill in some simple details before we specify some further information. So for the title, we are going to call this our tutorial API. The description, we can name it something like this is a tutorial API for creating a CRUD interface. And contact, we will leave blank for now. Our version can be 1. And for the sake of, so tags essentially, if we look at the UI later, it will simply be kind of a header. So we can call this one just something like API. It doesn't really matter. And now we come to the important section. This is the paths. So this is where you specify the routes or the endpoints that you're going to want to have available in your API. Now, for our purposes, we are actually only going to have one route, but we will have different HTTP methods to access it. So we've already specified the get method, but we can also specify later the post, the patch, and the delete methods. For this one, we're going to put the tag as API, as we got from this one earlier here, and you can see that in the graphical user interface that we get here, we can see that the header for this particular method or this particular endpoint is API. In parameters, we have to think again about what we said regarding the inputs to our endpoints. And for receiving a piece of data, we are going to want the row and column number as input. And the best way to do this is to take them as parameters. So for this one, we're going to call it column. We're going to pass it as a query. We're going to say that this is a required query parameter, and we will call it a string. Now, you might argue that actually this should be a number, but for our purposes it doesn't actually matter. You could call it a number as well. But if for any reason you want your table to be named by A, B, C, D, similar to how you would do it in Excel, we can call it a string, and it won't really matter much, to be quite honest. Next, let's specify another name, another parameter here, and we'll call that one row. We'll say it is in query as well. It is required, and we will make it a string as well. Again, we can change all these things later if we don't like it. And that will do it for the get method. For responses, we have to specify at least one response. For this one, we will keep it pretty simple, and we will wait until we implement our API to specify how we want our responses to work. So for now, we're going to leave the schema blank, and we're going to leave schemas for a separate video, or for later in this video perhaps. And now we're going to talk about the description. So we can simply call it successfully received data in cell. Now let's comment this whole piece of code right here, and we'll paste it right after, because we're going to change this to a post requests, post. And for this one, we're going to want parameters, column as well, and we're going to want a row as well. These stay the same because, as we saw earlier, we will need row and column for both posts as well. But in this scenario, we're also going to need something called a request body. And our request body starts to get a bit more complicated. So when you encounter request body, you might wonder, okay, how do I define a request body? And thankfully, on Swagger, you can look up how to do this. So request body, and we can see how do we describe a request body. Okay, let's see. So in their documentation, it says a request body should have a description, just say if it's required, and then it should list some kind of content with a schema as well. Now all we're going to do is we're going to copy paste this piece of code right here, and we will paste it, and we can put down a description. So the request body we can describe as the data to provide to our database. It is required, and for this particular application we are only going to store JSON, and we will specify a schema. We'll call this a post schema for now. Now that we've specified a request body, we've specified a response, and that means that we can move on to the next endpoint. Now, off camera, I'm going to briefly implement patch and delete as well, but what you will notice is that it will look basically the same as before. So, see you guys when I've implemented those as well. Okay guys, so as you can see, I've briefly created both the patch specification and the delete specification. The delete specification, because obviously we don't provide any data, we don't actually need a request body. But for the patch one, I've included a request body, and the schema that we're going to use I've called patch schema. Now let's briefly take a look at kind of the graphical aspect of this specification, because on our right here we can see these are the specified parameters for a GET request, and this is an example response. And we can do this for each one of our endpoints. So you can see now we also have a request body that's provided. And as of now, we don't have any examples for this, but that we will do right away. Now let's say you didn't know how to specify schemas. Well, as you can see here in our reference, that schemas are actually provided under the components section. So if we go and we look up Swagger component, then we should get this component section, and that allows us to see exactly what a components section looks like, and also what kind of structures they have. Now for our purposes, we can simply copy this code right here, and we can put it at the bottom of our document. Now, what schemas have we defined previously? We've defined a post schema, and we've defined a patch schema. What we can do now is we can look at defining, well, obviously this is a JSON object, and we also want it to have one particular property. In this case, we want that property to be called data. You can also call it something like cell value. I think in this case I rather have cell value. I think it's more descriptive. It will be of type, and in this case, as we mentioned earlier, this will be of type string. So we can do this for both our schemas. And as you can see in this scenario, we wouldn't actually need to have two different schemas, but since we might want to change either one of these in the future, we might as well define both of them right away. And we're getting a warning here that says definition was declared but never used in a document, and that is because we have actually made a bit of a typing error here. And once we fix that, and once we fix the typing error up here, you should see that, okay guys, it was bugging, but actually, as we can see, the error disappeared once the document was reloaded. And so now we've introduced both the schemas that we need for our post and patch endpoints. And so when you look at the example value, you can see here that this is a sal value of type string. Now, what this seems to suggest is that we can provide some kind of example value to our schema. Now, I believe that what we can do is type example, and let's call this one Sweden for now. Completely random, but we will call this one. So, as you can see, we can also specify different example values for our schemas. And at this point, our specification is looking pretty good, and we have no errors, and it actively describes all that we want to know about the platform, with one big missing feature, and that is that our responses section is not fully figured out yet. But we will leave this part for a future episode, because it is more related to the implementation of our actual API and is not very relevant to how we design our endpoints initially. At this point, what we can do is we can click on File, you can click on Save as YAML, or you can convert it and save as JSON. What I recommend is doing both. So we will save it as a YAML file, and we will convert and save it as JSON. Now, after having pasted both of these documents in our tutorial project, we can rename them by removing these parentheses. Let's do the same for our JSON file. And at this point, we are ready to upload our API to OpenAPI Hub, and we are also ready in the next episode to start writing some actual code. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys in the next one.